So welcome to the Office of Federal Register. This is a workshop on the Federal Register, what it is and how to use it. The Federal Register is produced by the Office of the Federal Register, and I often say that our office perhaps should be named the Office of the Code of Federal Regulations, because the body of material that we're involved in producing is federal regulations issued by executive branch agencies. And then our Federal Register is the means by which that body of information, the Code of Federal Regulations, is updated on a regular basis. Today we're going to be going through the following topics. I want to give you the legal basis for the Federal Register system. We'll talk about how it came about. It hasn't always existed since the beginning of the federal government, but why did it? Why was it created when it was? What the regulatory process is in the federal government, and particularly the role of the public in that process. How then an individual volume of the Federal Register and the Code of Federal Regulations is organized. We'll actually look at each of those books so you'll know how to navigate around that. And by the end of this workshop, you should have a good grasp of the relationship between the Code of Federal Regulations, the Federal Register, and public laws. If you don't understand that by the time I'm done, then I failed in my primary mission today. And then we'll also expose you to some research tools for using the Federal Register. The Federal Register office produces not just the Federal Register, but these other publications. Some of them are very much related to federal regulations, and some have a little less connection to them, but we will be addressing those as we go through our topic. So let's start with the legal basis for the Federal Register. Whenever the Congress passes a law and it is sent to the President for signature, the two ways that a law can become official is by signature of the President, right? Or if the President vetoes the law, then by overriding of the veto by the Congress. In any case, once an action is taken to make that either by law, by the President's signature law, or by overriding the President's veto, the document that bears the signatures comes physically to our office, the Office of the Federal Register. And the first thing that we do is we give that document a public law number. So prior to arriving in our office, when this is sitting on the President's desk, it has what we call a legislative number. For instance, HR 62 or S 22, depending on which chamber of the Congress it was originated in. It would depend on what the number is. When it comes here, then we designate it with its public law number. So in this case, I have a sample. It's Public Law 109225. And that means what? The 109th Congress. What's the 225? The 225th law passed during that Congress. How long does a session of Congress last? 2 years. I'm sorry, a Congress lasts 2 years, and it's made up of two sessions, a first session and a second session. The laws are numbered throughout the entire Congress, so you don't start the numbering system over again with the second session of Congress. So we give this the public law number. Then we review the law, not to change anything in it, but to add some information that is useful to the public when they read the law. And we produce the first official version of the law in pamphlet form, or what we call slip laws. So laws can be very large. Here's one that's probably 400 pages long, and smaller ones, and even one that's just a page long. So laws can be very large or very small. But if you look at any of these, you will see a couple things. The slip law contains margin information about here's a section that creates a requirement to produce regulations, or here's a requirement that has an expiration date or a deadline. Useful information to people who need the law. But one of the things that you'll find on each of these slip laws, these pamphlet laws, is this additional citation up here at the top. And it says in this case 124 Stat 3677. That's a citation to the United States statutes at large, which is this buckram colored volume. These are the United States statutes at large. And this is a compilation of all the laws passed by Congress every year. We create a new volume for each session of Congress. So there might be 2 or 3 books in a particular volume. So this is volume 116, and it is for the second session of the 107th Congress. So this particular law is going to fit right there. And this citation, 124 Stat 3677, simply means the 124th volume, page 3677. So how is it that we know what page this is going to be in before we produce this volume? Because this volume is produced about 6 months to a year after the end of the Congress. How do we know what page number to put on? Well, because this is a compilation of laws, if the first law had 20 pages, then this would be, in this case, volume 116, would be 116 Stat 1, 20 pages long. The next law is going to be 116 Stat 21, right? If it's 100 pages, then the third law is going to start at 116 Stat 121, right? So the point I want to make in this is that I've just given you 3 ways to refer to legislation. You can refer to it as legislative number, what it originally was, H.R. 62, or you can refer to it as its public law number, which is this whole complete piece, or you can find its location in the whole series of laws, the United States statutes at large, okay? Now, in the body of this law, you're also going to find one other reference. On the side, in this case, there's a reference to 49 U.S.C. 4001. What do you think USC stands for? The United States Code. So this was the statutes at large. This purple volume is the United States Code. Both contain the laws of the United States. Does anyone know the difference between the 2 volumes? Well, the statutes is a compilation. The U.S. Code, the word code gives you a hint, is a codification. How is a codification different from a compilation?
Well, if something goes wrong between the process of the law being legislated and passed and so forth, it may not make it into the code.
Okay, the answer is perhaps there's something that goes wrong after it's been signed, it doesn't get into the U.S. Code.
Yeah.
Once it's signed, it's a law.
It's a law.
The only way to undo a law would be to pass another law, undoing it. So that's a good thought. But the hint is actually in the word code. It's a codification. It's a collection of these laws by subject. So while this is chronologically ordered and compiled, this is ordered by subject. So you have subjects like defense, revenue, Social Security, transportation, okay? Now, how is that different? Well, a law, as it moves through the legislative process, may be amended with what is called non-germane material, right? In Congress, not lots of laws get passed, so often members, in an attempt to make sure that some piece of legislation in which they're very interested makes it out of the Congress, they'll attach it or seek to attach it to some other vehicle that's moving through, right? So when you get the final law, it's going to contain material that's not germane to the primary subject. So if this is a transportation bill, it may contain some information relating to, let's say, Social Security. All of that is going to be compiled in the U.S. statutes at large. But for the U.S. Code, we're going to cut the portion that relates to transportation and stick it into the portion that relates to transportation. And we'll take the rest that relates to Social Security or defense or whatever subject and put it in that place within the U.S. Code, okay? So U.S. Code is a way of organizing the laws by subject. And what are those subjects called? Well, they're called titles, okay? So you have Title VI of the United States Code references a particular subject matter of law. And a title can cover laws that may affect many different agencies. It's everything related to that particular area of transportation. So my question then to you would be, are there any laws that are in the U.S. statutes at large that don't make it in the U.S. Code? By virtue of asking the question, you can probably figure out that the answer is yes. But what law would not get into the United States Code? What kind of laws wouldn't make it into the United States Code? Incidentally, the statutes are published by this office. The United States Code is published by the Office of the Legal Counsel in the House of Representatives. Well, let's think about this. When some of you in the audience are federal employees working for a particular agency, that agency was established at some point in time. And the first legislation establishing that agency, we often call the Organic Act. And if you're an agency that deals with energy, you could find that original act in the title of the U.S. Code that deals with energy, right? So as years go by, perhaps the legislation, the original legislation is amended, create some new programs within the energy field. That's one kind of thing that you're going to find in the U.S. Code. But this year, Congress appropriated a certain amount of money for your operations for this year. And next year, it's going to appropriate a different amount of money for your operations, correct? Those are, in a sense, temporary laws. They have the full force and effect of law, right? But they're just temporary for this year. So we're not going to incorporate or codify an appropriations bill into the United States Code. So that's one type of law, what I call temporary law, that you won't find in the U.S. Code. Another kind is private law. Did you know there is such a thing as private law? Is it secret law? No. Does anybody know what a private law is? Well, the definition of law is generally general applicability and legal effect. Okay? General applicability. Here are the provisions. If you meet the criteria or lay down the provisions, then the law applies to you. So if the Social Security law says that you can begin to collect retirement at a particular age, say 65, well then when you reach the age 65, you're qualified. They didn't have to name you, right? They didn't have to say, they didn't have to know my birthday to tell me or put my name in the law. They just said anybody who reaches 65 becomes eligible. That's most of our law. That's public law. But occasionally, Congress will pass private law. And that means law that has a specific intended, it applies to a specific person. And I have a wonderful example here at your desk of a news story about the most recent private law. They don't come out very frequently, but in this case, an individual who's in our military was sent off to a combat zone and unfortunately died, was killed. Prior to going on that deployment, he was married, but in a ceremony that was conducted from a distance through telephone. This is allowed in the military. But our immigration law requires that for a person to emigrate to the United States, I left out a very key thing. He married a foreign national, okay? And so this person wasn't a U.S. citizen. Then he went off to combat and was killed in combat. And the spouse wanted to come to the United States and become a citizen. Well, our immigration laws require that there has to be physical contact. The marriage has to be consummated in order for it to be a legitimate marriage. So you can't just call someone in a foreign country, get married, and then that person is now eligible to enter the United States as a citizen. We all understand how that could be abused. But in this case, it was a legitimate, real marriage. They had had a relationship before the actual marriage. And so there was no way for this person to come into the United States unless the law was changed. You can understand why Congress wasn't interested in changing the law across the board. So this law, called a private law, was enacted for this particular individual, for this particular situation, and it applies to this individual only. Again, this is not done in secret. That's not what private law means. It just means that it has specific applicability. And we don't codify those in the United States Code. You would find those in the statutes at large, but not the United States Code. I want to comment on some other kinds of law that you'll encounter too. Permanent law. Well, isn't all of this permanent law? Well, it is, but over time, the U.S. Code gets pretty heavily amended. And so for a lawyer to figure out what is current law can involve quite a bit of research. And so occasionally, the Congress will pass a complete section of the U.S. Code as positive law, okay? Positive law. And that means that now you could refer to the U.S. Code as a particular section. You don't have to make reference to as amended by, as amended by, as amended by, okay? So it takes a chunk of the U.S. Code and says this is, it enacts it as a complete piece, all right? That's what we call positive law. Administrative law is law that develops as a result of legal cases involving federal regulations. And so this is a great point to make one of my key distinctions during this workshop. I've just talked about the United States Code, but I'm going to spend most of my time not talking about this code, but another code. And that's the red book that I have here and that you have at your desk, the Code of Federal Regulations. All right? We call this the CFR. We call this purple book the UFC. What's the difference between these two codes? The U.S. Code and the Code of Federal Regulations.
One's written by Congress, one's written by the agencies.
Exactly. The answer is one is written by Congress, one is written by agencies. I just want to make sure that this is a clear concept in your mind. The laws create the programs. The laws are written by Congress. Congress is a part of the legislative branch. In our constitutional system, those laws are then administered and executed in the executive branch, headed by the president, right? And the president has all of the cabinet departments, all of the independent agencies that are a part of this executive branch administering the laws of the United States. And they are administered by issuing further programmatic details that we call rules and regulations. And we compile those, codify them in the Code of Federal Regulations, all right? So the CFR is the collection of all the rules issued by executive branch agencies to implement the laws passed by Congress, the legislative branch of government, okay? So can there be any rules without a law? Can the executive branch issue rules just without any legislative authority?
No?
Exactly, they cannot. There must be some legislative authority explicitly stated for an agency to be able to issue a rule. Very key concept in our democracy. Congress can only legislate based on the powers given to it by we the people in the Constitution. So we have the foundation of the Constitution. On top of that, we have the laws of the United States. And from those, then, agencies have the authority to issue rules, okay? Now, that helps me understand a fundamental distinction between how private sector and public sector employees operate. Sometimes there's the image that public sector, federal employees or any state and local employees are bureaucratic mindset people, not as flexible as entrepreneurs in the private sector. But my question to you is, what is the fundamental thing that a public sector employee must ask that is different from the fundamental question that the private sector asks? Well, it's this. In the public sector, we're saying, do I have some positive authority to do this? Because if I don't, I'm not allowed to do it. Whereas in the private sector, the question is there any fundamental prohibition to doing something? And if not, I can do everything up to the lines of prohibition. Let me give you a practical example. In the government, there's an organization called the Government Printing Office. Okay? It prints government publications. As you can imagine, those are not always the most exciting materials. They're important materials, but they aren't the best sellers. There are lots of other books that sell better. So let's switch over to the private sector. We have a company, let's say an auto company, that back in the recession was suffering pretty heavily. And let's say in that company their decision was, they were discussing how can we increase our profits, and someone said, you know, there are these books called Harry Potter books, and they're selling really well. Why don't we start publishing books? Is there any law that prohibits Ford Motor Company or Chrysler Motor Company from selling Harry Potter books? They could decide to do it, a business decision, they could do it, right? Let's say the government printing office said, our books aren't selling real well. Let's sell Harry Potter books. Could they do that? No, because the government printing office has no authority to do any publishing except of official government publications, all right? So the question being asked at the government printing office is, what are we given the authority to do? That's what I can do, and I need to find where those lines are and not step over those lines. Where in the private sector, the question is, where are the lines? Because I can run up all the way up to that line. So for instance, if Ford Motor Company were to say, well, selling drugs, illegal drugs, is a pretty profitable adventure for some people. Why don't we start selling cocaine? Why could they not do that? It's obviously prohibited activity. So if you begin to see that, you begin to see what motivates, or what kind of situation federal employees, state employees, public employees are relative to their private sector counterparts. And that's not a bad thing, because we don't want our government, which we have limited through the Constitution and given explicit powers and withheld other powers. We don't want our government just going out and doing whatever it wants to do. That's not the way democracy works. It's a rule of law. So that, I hope, gives you a little bit of a picture of why regulations are based on law and law is based on constitutional principles. It also gives you some exposure to some of the other publications that our office is involved in. At this point, let's take a look at why the Federal Register office exists and the Federal Register itself. It didn't always exist. The United States government seemed to function pretty well for the first 100 or so years without the Federal Register. So why did it come about? Well, as you know, the federal government has grown over time, and one of the major spurts of growth occurred as a result or in response to the Great Depression in the 30s. So there was a sense of crisis, and the FDR administration was elected, and his mode of approach was to experiment. There was the 100 days of initial legislative activity that he pushed, and a lot of new agencies were created with a lot of new authorities to do things that the federal government had never been involved in. There had been the involvement in railroads and the Sherman Antitrust Act, so there had been some involvement in the economy, but for the most part, government stayed out of that kind of area of involvement. But with the New Deal legislation, a lot of new agencies were created that were doing regulations. They were issuing rules, issuing requirements on the federal, on the public. In that, it was a whole new era and a whole new field of operations. There was no process that was established for how rules would be issued. So literally, some agencies would publish them in newspapers, some would post them on bulletin boards, some would put them in write them and put them in file cabinets. So there was no centralized system for finding out what those were, and that went to the issue of access. Both because communications were not as good, transportation was not as good, and also because I think the mindset of government at that time did not have the strong, open transparency focus that we're used to. It was pretty difficult at times for those who were regulated by these rules to know what the regulations were. In addition, there was no organized system. If you went to one agency, the regulations were in one format. If you went to another agency, they were in another format. So this whole growth industry of federal regulations was kind of unregulated itself, and there were a lot of problems developing. There were some other issues that were bubbling underneath that, and that was this. There was quite a bit of scholarly discussion about whether agencies had the constitutional right to issue a rule, because the rules seemed to be a lot like laws. And I like to use this illustration that I hope will help you understand this. Here in Washington, D.C., on July 4th every year, there's a great big fireworks celebration. And if you're here, you know that celebration of those fireworks are launched from barges out in the Potomac River. All right. The Potomac River, by federal law, like all inland waterways in the United States, is regulated by the Coast Guard. So as a result of that authority to regulate commerce on inland waterways, before July 4th each year here in Washington, D.C., the Coast Guard issues a temporary regulation restricting private boats around a certain area in the Potomac River where these barges are and where they're going to be launching the fireworks. Okay, makes sense. Why would they do that?
Safety.
Safety, right? And the Coast Guard is charged for safety, so we all understand why they're doing that. Okay. Now, let us pretend that I have a boat, a pleasure craft. Okay, and I invite my family to Washington, D.C. for the 4th of July, and we're out on the boat. And I wander into the restricted area, all right? And along comes a National Park Service boat that polices the river, and they stop me and they board my boat and they cite me for violation of that regulation, all right? So I am being found not guilty, but I'm being charged with violating a regulation. And let's pretend, we're doing a lot of pretending here, pretending that the maximum penalty is $10,000 fine and 5 years in prison. Okay, and I was very reckless, so likely I'm going to get the maximum on that. Well, in the process of looking around my boat, they discover cocaine. All right, so now I'm arrested for violation of a federal statute prohibiting controlled substances. Right. And again, let's pretend that the maximum penalty is 5 years in prison, $10,000 fine. Okay, so I go to court and I am found guilty on both counts, both violating the regulation and violating the law, and I am given the maximum sentence. My question to you is, does the 5 years that I spend in prison paying off my debt for violating the rule issued by the Coast Guard feel any different to me than the 5 years I spend paying off my debt to society for violating the law against having possession of controlled substances? Does the $10,000 that leaves my bank account to pay for violating the rule feel any different than the $10,000 that leaves my bank account for violating the law? No. So it feels a lot like violation of a rule is violating a law, which is to say, a rule feels a lot like a law, doesn't it? We often say if it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, walks like a duck, you can pretty much say it's a duck. And people were saying, you may call these rules, you may call them regulations, but they are laws. They impose requirements, they impose potential penalties, they can take away your liberties. That's what laws are for. And when we read the Constitution the last time, what branch of government was given the lawmaking authority? What branch? Legislative, right? The Congress. So why is the Coast Guard issuing laws? Isn't that a violation of the separation of powers that's written in our Constitution? Moreover, these laws are made by people who I get to vote for and who I can influence. But these rules are being issued by some nameless bureaucrat inside, and I'm picking on the Coast Guard, inside the Coast Guard that I don't know, and I don't have any involvement in their work. So doesn't that violate the principles of due process and fairness that are embedded in our Constitution? Okay? There's some interesting questions that were bubbling around the whole time in the 30s. Well, these questions kind of came to a head in a very interesting court case that the Supreme Court dealt with. And it had to do with a case brought against an oil company for violating some regulations issued by the Interior Department. The National Recovery Act was one of Franklin Roosevelt's signature accomplishments in the 100 Days. And it gave the Interior Department the authority to impose regulations about the costs or the prices charged for oil that crossed state lines. So this company was cited for violating those rules. And the case went up through the courts, was appealed, ended up in the Supreme Court. And in that process, the justices asked the Justice Department to bring to the court the original signed regulation. All right? Sounds pretty simple. So the lawyers went back to the Justice Department and they brought a copy, what we would call a Xerox copy. It was a mimeograph copy of the original regulation. Now, the Supreme Court justices didn't feel that was responsive. Why would a copy not be adequate for a court case? Why would the justice not be satisfied with a copy of a regulation? Yes?
It could be altered.
It could have been altered. It could have been very easy for someone to go back, and we understand this in our day, type it up right today and submit it, where the signed original would have been dated and would be evidence of the real thing. So the court was very unhappy with that. The reason the lawyers didn't bring the original is they couldn't find it. It had been lost in the process, which illustrated one of the big problems that we were just mentioning, that there was a lack of organization to this whole system. But there was a deeper problem. The regulation that had been the basis for bringing the case, they discovered had been rescinded a month before the court case had begun. So within the Interior Department, the right hand, one agency, sub-agency, didn't know what the left hand, another sub-agency with the Interior Department, was doing. They were doing contradictory things. And as a result, here this oil company had been drugged through the courts on an issue that actually had been moot the entire time. So the court obviously found in favor of the company, but issued a scathing opinion basically saying to the Congress, get this process in shape. And as a result, Congress did. They passed the Federal Register Act. Here's what the Federal Register Act did. Well, let me say before I describe the Federal Register Act, that was the first of 3 basic laws that formed the legal structure for the federal regulatory system. So we have the Federal Register Act, we have the Administrative Procedure Act, which we'll talk about. It came along in the 40s. The Congressional Review Act that came along in the 1990s. So these are the 3 primary pillars on which the legal structure, it is the legal structure, the primary pillars on which the federal regulatory process rests. There are other individual laws that are passed, and occasionally they will say something that requires an agency to do something in addition. For instance, it might require an agency to issue a rule within 6 months. Well, that 6-month requirement is not in the Federal Register Act or the Administrative Procedure Act or the Congressional Review Act, but occasionally those are additional requirements placed on an agency. What did the Federal Register Act do? Well, first of all, it created a central location where all federal regulations would be located, and that is the Office of the Federal Register. That's this office. So the first thing that our predecessors in this office did was to send out a call to all agencies to say, open those file cabinets, pull those regulations off the bulletin boards, go out, find your books, wherever there are federal regulations, send them to us so that we can be the single depository, single place where the public can go and find information about regulations. The second thing that the Federal Register Act did was to create a new publication called the Federal Register, in which henceforth any new regulation would have to be published. So from now on, you can't just publish it in the newspaper or post it on a bulletin board or put it in a file cabinet. Instead, you have to publish the document in this book called the Federal Register. Okay, this is a daily publication. This is an average size, so you can see it's quite a sizable publication. But it is the means by which now you and I, the public, American citizen, can find out what new rules are being issued. Then, about 2 years later, after receiving these rules and realizing there were far more regulations than anybody had any idea, we realized there was a need for some codification of that. So in 1937, an amendment to the Federal Register Act created the Code of Federal Regulations. Now, what is a code? It's a codification, okay? And if you are creating a new code, there was a very good model of a code available, right? The U.S. Code. The U.S. Code had 50 titles, or 50 subjects were covered in the U.S. Code. So guess how many titles it was determined would be put in the Code of Federal Regulations? 50, right? And the subjects were very similar subjects. So the model for the U.S., or the Code of Federal Regulations, was the existing United States Code. The difference, obviously, is what? The U.S. Code contains what? Laws. The Code of Federal Regulations contains rules. Okay? We call this the USC. We call this the CFR. So, because the Office of the Federal Register was created before there was a Code of Federal Regulations, we are the Office of the Federal Register. I think it might make more sense today, in some ways, to refer to us as the Office of the Code of Federal Regulations, who amends our regulations via the Federal Register. But be that as it may. What is the effect of publishing in the Federal Register? Well, first of all, it gives official notice. You know what official notice means? It means that you can be held, you and I can be held liable for the information being provided. That means that even if you didn't wake up this morning and log on to the Federal Register or read your Federal Register, whatever is in there is information that you can be held accountable for. This is what we call constructive notice. It's a legal term. Actual notice would mean that I went to your house and handed you a letter or a document and put it in your hand. That's actual notice, right? But if I'm regulating millions of people by this particular regulation, I'm not probably going to be able to do that. So this is the means that Congress says, by virtue of publishing in the Federal Register, it will have been deemed to have given constructive notice for legal purposes to the public. Now you might say, but I don't read the Federal Register every day. And if it has the force of effective law, isn't that kind of a scary situation for me to be in? Well, I'd ask you, have you read every law that's ever been passed? Do you read the U.S. Code? And you've been able to survive? How is that? Is it because these things are not important? No, it's vitally important, right? We want to protect people from doing things like going close to fireworks on July 4th, and lots of other things we want to be sure people are protected from, or that they know their rights. And we also know people, like that example I just used, could be found guilty of violating things, and bad things could happen as a result of that. So how do you stay aware of what is legally, your legal requirements? What are some ways that you know what your legal requirements are? When new laws are passed, how do you find out about them? I mean, some obvious ways, right? Newspapers, television, the internet, texts. There's just a whole broad range of means by which this material is publicized. One in particular that you may not be thinking of right away is all of us have what I call affinity groups. So you think about what you do outside your working life, or as a part of your working life. If you're a teacher, you're interested in education issues, right? Maybe you are a person who loves pets and are interested in issues that deal with animal health. You probably may have a membership in some association or other that focuses on that. And that association is likely to send out newsletters and alerts and the like, right? So we are hooked into, in many ways, networks of the areas that are of particular interest, and hopefully through those means we are finding out about a lot of this stuff. So our pitch is not that everybody read the Federal Register every day, but if you understand this process, then as you read the newspapers, as you get some of this information, you will become more and more aware of things that you do want to participate in, and I'll explain that process, because the Federal Register process gives you a way to participate. But all of that is sort of to say, by publishing in the Federal Register, you have official notice about some very important action that the government may be taking. A document that's published in the Federal Register also states the legal authority of an agency to take that action. And in our constitutional democracy, that is a very important thing. We do not allow any documents to be published without an agency describing the legal authority in law that they have for taking that action. That protects our rights. Thirdly, if you go to court and the agency is challenged as to what the law is, they will no longer say, bring us the signed original. You could take the Federal Register or the Code of Federal Regulations into court and it would be accepted as evidence. You could even take your laptop containing the online versions of the Federal Register and the CFR, and they would be accepted as official evidence in court. A fourth thing that a document published in the Federal Register does is provide editors who are editing the Code of Federal Regulations with the specific instructions about what to do to this book. So this book is going to be updated based on new rules published in the Federal Register and the Code of Federal Regulations. I'm sorry. The CFR is going to be updated by new regulations published in the Federal Register. So think cut and paste. We want to make sure we cut the right things and paste in the right things, because if we cut out the wrong thing, we will be cutting out some law, right? Some in-force action. And so it's critical that the agencies in publishing their document be very explicit about how we are to update the CFR and when. What day is the new rule effective? So all of that comes under the heading of the effects of publishing in the Federal Register. Now, the Federal Register Act did not respond to all of the problems that existed in relation to the regulatory system, specifically some of the constitutional issues. That question of how is it that in Congress I can influence legislation by my vote, I'm represented by an elected official, but in the bureaucracy I have no access. This was genuinely a problem that was being described. And Congress addressed that with a very innovative process, a very innovative law called the Administrative Procedure Act in the 1940s. You've probably heard of this. It's one of the key pillars now of the federal regulatory process. First of all, the Administrative Procedure Act created a process by which agencies didn't simply issue a new regulation, but it required them to issue a proposed rule before they issue the final rule. So in other words, agencies are required to tell you and me what they are proposing to do and give us the opportunity, this is the second part, very important, to comment upon it. Okay, for the first time, this process was opened up to the public. Here's what we're thinking of doing. Here's how we're thinking of regulating shipping. Here's how we're thinking of changing rules that relate to your credit cards. What do you think of this? Give us your thoughts. The public comments, and then based on those comments, the agency, which is required to take into account those comments, issues a final rule. The final rule then, and this is the third piece of the Administrative Procedure Act, the final rule cannot be effective until 30 or 60 days has passed. In other words, it can't be immediately effective. There's got to be a period for the regulated public to adjust to these rules. So, the Administrative Procedure Act is a very creative way to democratize the process. And we have found that this model of notice and comment has been repeated throughout the states. All 50 states now have this process for their state regulations. And it's a process that emerging democracies are learning about. We often will have visitors from other countries who are building democratic principles into their systems come talk to us about how to make their regulations more open and more responsive to the citizenry. So this is the notice and comment process that those of you who are involved in federal rulemaking probably are aware of. The third pillar of the federal regulatory system is the Congressional Review Act. Now, Congress, being the legislative body, always has oversight of the executive branch activities, right? You see congressional hearings where executive agency heads are brought before them and grilled. So the executive branch is always responsive to the congressional branch. But the Congressional Review Act gave a formal process to the Congress to review any proposed rules. So when a rule is delivered to our office at the Federal Register, it's also delivered to the Congressional Committee of Oversight that reviews that and may take action to overturn it by joint resolution. It's only happened once. This mechanism has only been used to overturn some regulations that were issued by OSHA back in the 90s that were felt to be a little too intrusive in small businesses. But it addressed the concerns about the separation of powers and legislative oversight that were being described. There are some other parts to the federal regulatory process that I want to be sure you are aware of. And there are three: agency dockets, administrative requirements, and a thing we call regulatory review. I'll go over these briefly with you. In each agency, there is an office, usually it's called the docket office, that maintains files related to every federal rulemaking. And the docket is a court term. If you go to the county courthouse, you'll see today's docket. So in a sense, because these are legal processes that agencies are going through, they have this, they've used this term. A docket will contain all the related materials to a particular rulemaking. So all the comments received by the public, any official documents released by the agency, and all of this is open to the public. Specifically, the comments. So when you comment on a regulation, I can read your comments. When I comment on a regulation, you can read my comments, okay? So it's a very open process. It's public information. It's managed online through the Federal Document Management System, which I'll reference a little bit later. But this can be reached through regulations.gov. Every agency now has all of that docket material maintained electronically. The second part that I want to make you aware of are administrative requirements. Besides the law, both Congress and presidents have issued some requirements that agencies carry out particular analyses whenever they are preparing to issue regulations. Now, I'm going to hold up a chart here that is what we call a regulatory map. This is just a map that a private sector group prepared. And I don't expect you to be able to read any of it, but I just want to point out this center column because it visually shows you the number of analyses that an agency has to go through in preparing a regulation. And an example would be the Environmental Protection Act. You know, an environmental impact statement often has to be prepared for certain kinds of regulatory actions. Federalism, what's the impact of this on federalism issues? Regulatory Flexibility Act, does this create flexibility or not? Unfunded mandates, does it impose a mandate on states that is not funded? These are all analyses that over time, either the Congress or the President determine need to be addressed in the creation of new regulations. Some are there because Congress has passed legislation requiring them. Some are there because the President has required them through executive orders, okay? And so you will see as we go on, when we look at some of these documents, there are references to these regulatory analyses. Finally, in connection to the whole regulatory structure, I want to talk about regulatory review. An agency doesn't operate in a vacuum. An agency is in, first of all, a constitutional and legislative space. You know, it's been given a particular statutory mandate. It also exists in a political environment, right? The government is a political entity, meaning it reflects the popular opinion. And when we elect a new president, that president may have a different set of priorities or a political agenda than the previous president. And the president coming into office has a lot of appointments that the president can make, but there are many, many, many more federal employees than there are political appointees in the executive branch of government. So it is a very large vessel, and very large vessels take time to be moved, to be turned, right? So if a president is wanting to impose his particular agenda on the policies of the administration, it's not a simple, okay, do this. It requires imposing into the bureaucracy mechanisms that help the president ensure his or her agenda is implemented. And particularly beginning in the Carter administration, this was done through an office in the Office of Management and Budget called the Office of Information and Regulatory Analysis. Now, I don't mean to say that all this review is political. Also, the review is scientific and objective analyses. In preparing a regulation, the president wants to know, did the agency do due diligence? Did it do good science in coming to the conclusion that it is implementing in a regulation? So if we're going to up the miles per gallon that we're going to require the automotive industry to hit as a standard average, and that's going to cost them, and it's going to cost the consumer, you need to have some pretty good science behind that, justifying that, right? So one thing that the OIRA is doing is just good policy review, checking out what did agencies do. But they're also saying, does this match line up with the president's agenda? So once major rules come out of agencies, they go over to OIRA in the Office of Management and Budget, part of the president's executive office, for review. And after the OIRA gives its blessing, then those documents come to our office for publication in the Federal Register. So if you're a part of the federal bureaucracy, this is a pretty key piece of process you need to be aware of. So here is a visual of the regulatory process overview. You must have authority in law, in a public law. Then, based on that, an agency can issue a proposed rule that's published in the Federal Register. After receiving public comment, they will publish a final rule in the Federal Register also. That will be incorporated into the Code of Federal Regulations if there is no objection formally by formal resolution of the Congress. So again, why was the Federal Register established? Well, the lack of access problem was addressed by the existence of this office. The lack of a process was addressed by the creation of the Federal Register publication itself. The lack of organization was addressed by creating the Code of Federal Regulations. The constitutional issues were addressed by creating the notice and comment process of the Administrative Procedure Act and by the Congressional Review process of the Congressional Review Act. So there we have why we ended up with this system that we have. And I think there's one final useful overview of the process to take, and that is to compare laws and rules. And I have in front of you here a good chart that is useful. Let's look at how these things are issued. First of all, Congress passes a law, and it's published as a slip law. And agencies issue a rule, and it's published as a document in the Federal Register. The laws are codified in the U.S. Code. The rules are codified in the CFR. Okay, you see the parallel. The authority or the power for Congress to act in making laws comes directly from the Constitution. The power for agencies to issue rules is a delegation from Congress. It's not directly from the Constitution, but delegated by Congress. And that means that when congressional actions are being reviewed, the only review that the co-equal branch of government, the judiciary, gives to laws is their constitutionality. Whereas a rule is reviewed by a much higher standard. First of all, the courts will ask the question, did the provisions of the Administrative Procedure Act, were they followed? So did you issue a proposed rule? Did you use it a certain amount of time that needed to be given? If the agency followed those, then we go to the next step. Well, was the action arbitrary and capricious? You might have followed the letter of the law, but were you doing something mischievous? Were you doing some action, taking some action that actually even benefited some of your own relatives or some other interest that had a improper impact, influence on the action? Well, if that didn't occur, even if you followed the law, it wasn't arbitrary and capricious, did the agency extend or go beyond their delegated authority? They might have done good things, but not good things that were things they had the delegated authority to do. And finally, if those tests are met, then do they meet the test of constitutionality? We have in the legal system really true representative democracy. I don't get to go on the floor of the Senate, but I do get to vote for a member. I get to communicate with the member. It's representing me. In executive agency rulemaking, there's actual participatory democracy. You and I are communicating directly with and must get responses from the agencies that are issuing the rules. And finally, I would say that Congress is generally passing broad policy issues, and agencies are prescribing specific legal requirements to meet those. All right, that's kind of how we would cut it. But this line between broad policy and specific requirements is not as sharp as I've driven that. And I'll close this section of our workshop with this example. Back in the 90s, there was a very aggressive head of the Food and Drug Administration who was very interested in or concerned about the impact of smoking on the health of Americans. and in his role as director of the Food Drug Administration, wanted to take some action. There's a little problem, though, that he faced, and that was that the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which is the organic act, or the act that gives the FDA authority to act, specifically prohibited the FDA from regulating tobacco. But this administrator went ahead and attempted to do that. Very interesting story about why he felt he could do it. You would think you're prohibited from regulating tobacco, can't do it. That's a broad policy statement that Congress has made. Tobacco was an important economic crop, important to agriculture in the United States when the FDA was passed, so don't mess with it by issuing regulations that affect it. Well, David Kessler said, you know what? That's the administrator. Tobacco is placed in a little white tube called a cigarette, and that's actually a drug delivery device. And the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act gives us the authority to regulate medical devices and drug delivery devices. You know, heart defibrillators, syringes, all of the medical equipment, x-ray machines, okay. So that was his creative attempt, solution to saying, I do have the legal authority to implement this very, broad policy interest. Now, Congress stopped him from doing it and said, no, you're regulating tobacco, stop it. But it's just an illustration of how agencies are often doing what we might sometimes think is the work of Congress. But Congress is also very much involved in this process at a very granular level. They will pass legislation that prohibits an agency from using any of the funds being appropriated for a specific policy venture. Okay, so it's the give and take. It's the balance that the founders of our Constitution put in our system, working well to balance out how laws are implemented. Let's get started. Understanding the structure of the federal regulatory system is key to understanding the documents that we publish in the Federal Register, because the way a document is written, the way a document is organized, has everything to do with meeting the requirements of the Federal Register Act and the Administrative Procedure Act. So if you were to get a paper copy of the Federal Register, or if you were to look at a Federal Register document online, it is not the easiest document to read through. It can be rather daunting. And you might ask, why is it printed in such dense type? Why is it written in such legalese type language? And I hope to unravel some of that mystery in this section. But a big part of that is understanding the idea of notice and comment, the understanding that a Federal Register document is affecting the Code of Federal Regulations. It's not a standalone document in itself. It's making reference to a standing body of information. And the needs for the public and for the courts is all a part of why documents are structured and organized the way they are. So having that background now, we're going to step into looking at an issue of the Daily Federal Register, more specifically documents in the Federal Register. Now I want to make one point right away, and that is that while we're talking about federal rules and federal regulations, the thing that we publish in the Federal Register is larger than the rule itself. We call them documents because the document contains not only the rule, but it contains information about the rule. So we're publishing about 150 documents every day. And as we get into this, you'll understand this distinction I made between the rule itself and the document that publishes the rule. The Federal Register is an official, legal, daily publication. So all of those three things. And we say that it informs citizens of their rights, obligations, opportunities, and then also federal actions that are of interest to the public. The way that a volume of the Federal Register would be cited legally would be to reference its volume number, which is changes every year, increases. We're in volume 77 now, FR, and then a page number. Now the page numbers begin with 1 on January 1st and continue to rise through the end of the year. And we publish approximately 80 to 85,000 pages in a year. And then in parentheses after that page number, the date. That'd be a good way to cite the document that's in the Federal Register. There are 4 categories of documents. We've talked about regulations, but you already know there's at least 2 kinds of regulations. There are proposed rules, and there are final rules, right? Now, also, I use the term rules and I use the term regulations. Is there a difference between a rule and a regulation? No. It's just that in 1930s, when the Federal Register Act was created, some agencies called what they were issuing rules, and some agencies called what they were issuing regulations. So you'll see that we use the term rules and regulations interchangeably. So here we have rules and proposed rules. But I also have, as a first category, presidential documents. And we're going to discuss why presidential documents are included in the Federal Register and are included in a discussion of federal rulemaking. Finally, though, the 4th category of document that you find in the Federal Register are notices. These are non-regulatory documents. These are documents that are published by agencies for the benefit of the public to provide notice of information that they might find valuable. For instance, there is an environmental impact statement available. There is a grant program available. Notices do not impose, nor do they propose to impose, any new rights or obligations, okay? They are not regulatory documents. They are there for public information. To confuse this matter a little further, the formal name of a proposed rule is a notice of proposed rulemaking. So a notice, or an NPRM, is different from a notice, all right? Just make that distinction up front here. So we are going to look at what these various documents look like. And to introduce that, I also want to introduce the places where you can find these materials. Now, obviously, I'm holding up a physical book. This is the physical Federal Register, and this is the physical copy of the Code of Federal Regulations. But all of this material is available online. The first place, and the official place where this material is available online, is at the government printing office's official website for their publications called FedSys. And I will pull up that website for you right now. This is the website FedSys. And on the right-hand side, you can see that you can browse quite a collection of various government publications, including the Federal Register and the Code of Federal Regulations. If you click on either of these links, you will go to the electronic version of this book. Now, this book was revised, the one I'm holding in my hand, happened to be revised as of April 1st, 2013. When you go to this website, FedSys, and go to the Code of Federal Regulations and look up this particular volume, which happens to be Title 21, you will see this book as revised April 1st, 2013. You will not see any additional changes to this after April 1, 2013, until next year when we issue the revision as of April 1st, 2014, okay? Likewise, the Federal Register that you will access through FedSys will be this book, organized like this, all right? So, this is the official version. This is the version you can take to court, all right? Now, another place that you can find our materials, and an unofficial version of them, is through our portal, the Office of the Federal Register's portal, which is simply ofr.gov. So I'm going to move us to that portal. This is ofr.gov, and you see it says the Office of the Federal Register and has some visuals of our publications. And here you can get access by either going to federal regulatory material where you get the CFR and the Federal Register, or federal laws where you get the statutes at large and slip laws, or presidential documents, which we haven't yet talked about. By clicking any of these tabs, you can get to that material. When you click on those, so let's go to the regulatory material, you're going to be offered the opportunity to go to it in its official format on GPO. So it would simply take you over to that website we were just on. Or it's going to give you the opportunity to go to a site that we call Federal Register 2.0 for the Federal Register, and the eCFR, or the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations, for the Code of Federal Regulations, okay? If you click on either Federal Register 2.0 or the eCFR, you're going to be taken to two different unofficial sites. Well, they're official sites, but unofficial versions of the Federal Register and the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations. Now, you may say, well, I don't want to see the unofficial, I want to see the official. What I want to tell you is that these versions are authentic and authoritative, because the very files that are used to publish these books are the files that you're going to see online at these unofficial websites. They are unofficial for a period of time. We are moving them, hopefully, into official status. There are a couple reasons we can't do that today. One of the primary reasons the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations is not the official version is because while I can show you what the Code of Federal Regulations looks like today, I can't show you what it looked like yesterday. And we want to be able to preserve the Code of Federal Regulations at any point in time, so a point-in-time system. But what is different about the eCFR from the version that's on FedSys is that we update the eCFR every day. So if you want to find out what is the current status, it's now not April 1st, let's say it's now July, you want to know what does this book look like as of July, because maybe there have been some changes. The eCFR is the place to go to see that, okay? It's authoritative, it's not official, so you wouldn't be able to take it to court, but you can trust it for purposes of what you probably need to use it for. Likewise, the Federal Register 2.0, and at this point, I'm going to go to that site. And this is a very easy site to get to by simply typing federalregister.gov. Federalregister.gov presents the Daily Federal Register in a very fresh, new, and broader way. By broader, I mean that unlike the other site, you are able here to see documents that were published earlier. There's a persistence in these documents. So, and we're going to look at this website a little further, but just to give you a taste of this, I click on one of the subjects, like money, and you see that it brings up relevant documents, some of which were published today and some of which may have been published earlier. So it also has persistence of documents for your use. All right. I don't want to confuse you too much at the front end of this discussion, but I want to explain to you that there are great, wonderful electronic resources to look at the material that I'm going to be showing you in paper format. Why am I showing you them in paper format? Well, it's because currently the process or the reason for the way documents are organized the way they are online is because of the way they're organized in print. If you understand how they're organized in print, you'll be really prepared to navigate through the other material that you find online. Okay, so what I want to do is take us through this book and show you some of the documents and teach you how to look at a document, how to understand how it's constructed. And instead of starting with the rules or presidential, I'm going to start with the proposed rule because that's where the regulatory process starts, right? An agency thinks, hey, we have a good idea, or maybe we have a mandate to create some regulations. And they issue a proposed rule. So a proposed rule, but remember, in the federal government, in the federal structure, the only place that you can have rules is in the Code of Federal Regulations. There's no other place where agencies can publish material that you are legally bound to follow. Okay, that should be comforting because there's a single place where you can be guaranteed that this is it. There's not some other material. But an agency may want to change that. So they're going to, in a proposed rule, propose some kind of change to an existing book. And in the process of doing so, they'll lay out the proposed text of the change. Okay? Or occasionally, rather than laying out the text, they'll describe it in detail the content of the change. Then they will say in the document, in effect, please tell us what you think. Give us your comments. We're opening this rule, this proposed rule up for public comment. And this is the initiation of the notice and comment rulemaking. So given that that is the purpose of a proposed rule, how is the document going to be structured? Well, it's going to be structured to address each of these things, particularly how the text is going to be set out. Here are some types of proposed rules. There are the primary notice of proposed rulemaking. Sometimes an agency will issue some preliminary documents. They may be thinking about proposing a rule, but want to get public input earlier on in the process rather than later. Or there may be other changes to the process. Perhaps they've proposed a deadline for receiving comments, and the agency wants to change that deadline. They would have to publish that as a proposed rule document. It's not going to change the language of the proposed rule, but it is changing when the comments are due. So all of those types of documents relating to the proposed rule stage of the game are what gets published in our proposed rules section. Now, those of you who have a book in front of you can turn to page 63, 254. And you'll see there the beginning of the section of the proposed rules in this book. So I'm looking at page 63, 224. And you'll notice in that very first document that you see there, or if you turn the page and look at some of the following documents, that all of them have this structure to them. They have a group of headings that are in bold. You notice first an agency name. And the agency of the document I'm looking at is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And then you see a citation to the CFR. In this case, 10 CFR Part 72. That is there because that's telling you what part of the Code of Federal Regulations this particular proposed rule is going to affect. Then there is a docket number or another number, sometimes called a RIN number. Now those two numbers are not always there. We don't require those numbers. But the docket is an intra-agency number. Okay, it's an agency. The NRC has decided this is the number for this rulemaking. That's a docket number. The RIN number, Regulatory Information Number, is an intergovernmental number. It's a number that is a system of numbering that is government-wide, run through the General Services Administration, GSA. You won't always see those numbers, but if you do, then you can reference those docket numbers in referring to the rule. Then you see a subject line. In this case, I'm looking at one that is related to research and education. Following those headings, you're going to always see 7 captions. The agency, the action, the summary, the dates, the addresses for further information, and supplementary information. Let me describe each of these, okay? And you, those of you who have a book in front of you, you can see these as we go through. The agency is repeated because this is how we are going to index it. So if it's a sub-agency, we're going to index it under the sub-agency rather than under the parent agency. So that's why it's duplicated. The action is to the customer, to the reader. Is this a proposed rule? Is this adding deadline or changing the deadline? It just gives you a little bit of information about what kind of action is involved. But in a proposed rule, it would always relate to what? The proposed rule stage of the game. Okay. The summary is a quick, paragraph-long, hopefully, statement of, in general, who, what, when, where, why. Why is this happening? Now, be aware that in the federal government, there are programs that deal with very complex subject matter, banking laws, revenue laws, EPA rules. And so when a novice like me reads some of these, even the simplified language can be rather challenging. But we do attempt to ask agencies attempt to write that summary in layperson's language, a quick, simple description of what is going on. And you will find that this summary is used in multiple places in the electronic environment. Okay. The dates of a proposed rule, what do you think the dates would be in a proposed rule? What is a proposed rule asking the public to do? Comment. And so there's got to be a deadline, right? So the dates in a proposed rule are the dates the comments are due. Addresses, where to send comments. Now, laws require that all regulations must be able to be addressed through a website, an electronic website called regulations.gov. So today, any of these documents will also include in the addresses the website regulations.gov, where a person can go find the document, find the proposed rule, and submit comments. It will also contain the mailing addresses, emails, other ways for the public to comment on it. Remember, any comments received are going to go into the docket, and the docket is it's public information available to the public. For further information, those of you who have the book, if you look at that, you'll notice a person's name, address, and telephone number. And I mention that to say this tells you how open this system is. No longer is there a faceless bureaucrat. This is the reason we have this in here, because agencies are issuing regulations that are complex, and it may be necessary for people to get additional information to make those contacts. That's the contact for that. And now we reach the supplementary information section of the document. This can be a very long section, because this is where the agency describes the problem or the opportunity and describes the solution they're proposing and makes the argument, makes the case, or asks the questions that they want the public to address. All right? So this is really rich, a really rich source of information about what is happening in an area that you may have interest in. These should be written so that somebody who got their job today or just opened the Federal Register today and doesn't know anything about what has happened previously in regard to this particular public policy would have an understanding. It might say, last year Congress passed this new legislation that required our agency to implement this new program, and we have to have regulations in place by a certain date, and we asked for some preliminary input this summer, and now we are proposing a rule. Also, in here, the agency is going to address those regulatory analyses that I mentioned to you. They're going to say, we have to do some of this, or here is some of the work that we have done on this. So that process begins. At the end of the supplementary information, in the document will be a line that I call the bright shining light. It's neither bright nor shining, but it's in every document, and it's the point at which you can know that all the preliminary information is over and you're about to read the rule, all right? And that bright shining light is the heading called List of Subjects, okay? So if you turn, for those of you who have a book in front of you, if you turn to page 63 to 31, at the bottom of that page, you will see a line that says List of Subjects. Again, I'm on page 63231, and you'll see the term List of Subjects. And I simply point that out because I'm saying everything before that is this preliminary information. If you turn the page, everything after that, and the only thing left is the actual regulation that's being proposed itself. And you notice that in that regulation, there are little black squares beside some numbers. That squares beside the number 1 means instruction number 1, and the square beside number 2 is instruction number 2, and the square beside number 3 is instruction number 3. Now what I'm saying to you is that at this point, the agency that's proposing a rule is saying, okay, we've told you in common language, common English, what we're going to do. Now our job is to tell you in very technical language what you editors at the Office of the Federal Register have to do to this book to implement what we said. So let me give you kind of a silly example from a law, okay? Because remember, laws and rules have a very similar structure. I have a law here that was passed by Congress in 2008. And I'm going to read the complete text of the law, all right? It says, be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, Section 903 of Title 11 of the District of Columbia Code is amended by striking 58 and inserting 61. Now, how many of you support that law? If you remember Congress, would you vote for that? How many are opposed? Now, why did you not raise your hand?
I don't know what it is.
It doesn't make any sense, right? There's no context, right? Well, the context is there. It says Section 301 of Title 11. That means go to the United States Code, Title 11, look up Section 903, and where you see the number 58, cut that number out and insert number 61. And you know what you've just done? You've added 3 judges to the District Court of Columbia, the District of Columbia. Okay, so this title had to do with the court system in the District of Columbia, and they're increasing the number of judges from 58 to 61. Why didn't they tell us that? Why is this the law? Because this is the only thing technically that had to happen, right, for that to occur. Now the description of what's happening would be found in the congressional debate. So you could go to the congressional record, right, and read the debate, or you could have watched it on CNN or some other means of reading and finding out what this bill was about. Well, likewise, the technical way that the agency is going to accomplish changing the rule is described like this. Section 52.379 of Part 52 is amended by adding paragraphs C, D, and F to read as follows. And then they have those paragraphs. So what they're doing is you're taking an existing body of rules and telling me specifically how to change this book, edit this book, so that it will accomplish what they want to accomplish. So just as we had to go to the congressional record to find out what that law meant, what the technical language of the law meant, where do you go to find what this technical instruction means? Well, you just turn the page back, right, to all the supplementary information. That's the point of this supplementary information, is to give you the information in layperson's language about what is being done in this technical rule change. Okay, so if you were to ask me, could I see a new rule that's being proposed for the government? I might give you what appears to you to be gibberish. It's take this paragraph out, add this sentence, change this word to this, change the word red to blue. And you wouldn't understand, perhaps, nor would I, exactly what's being done, except with having this book at your hand. And you could open it up and say, oh, I see, they're asking me to take this paragraph out and put this paragraph in. Is this understandable what I'm saying? That's why I said to you a little earlier that what we publish are not just rules, but documents that contain the rules. All right? The rules are the specific instructions about what to do to accomplish what you want to accomplish. And that is why, and that's one of the frustrations for us who are involved in this process, that you and I, when we go to something like the Federal Register, we quickly become frustrated by this technical language. Well, if you know to look in the summary, you'll be taken to the much simpler and easier way to understand what is being done. And then you can look at the rule and say, well, I don't think we should increase, the fuel standards, or I think we should increase the fuel standards. So this is how a proposed rule document is organized. There are some others that I described to you. An advance notice of proposed rulemaking is simply the effort of an agency to find out ahead of time whether or not they're headed in a direction that the public supports. Occasionally, you'll see a petition for rulemaking. Perhaps the public sees the need for some changes, and they petition an agency to engage in rulemaking. Well, the agency will publish that petition and ask for public comments, and based on their comments that are received, they will or will not begin the rulemaking. There's also a type of rulemaking called negotiated. So much of our regulatory environment seems to be kind of enemies, controversial kind of thing. And this was an effort to take that kind of tension out of it and say, let's get the regulators and the regulated public in the room together beforehand to negotiate out some of these things before the rule is written in secret and then handed over the transom door to the public to look at. This sometimes can help the process go a little smoother or a little quicker too. Some of the miscellaneous types of documents that we've already referred to, extending the time to submit documents, further time withdrawing proposed rules. So there are lots of different types of documents that we classify as proposed rules. Yes, question?
With the withdrawal of a proposed rule, let's say, sometimes rulemakings go on for 7 years from proposed to final. Let's say you get to the final rule and some technical issues come up and it's hung up and you don't know whether it'll ever be resolved. Do you have to publish a withdrawal of the proposed rule if, let's say, agency's just never going to do the final rule?
No, unless there's some other kind of requirement in some other law or some other the facet of the agency's operating.
So there's no requirement
procedures,
to withdraw
yeah.
it. It's just sometimes they do it because they change their minds about the direction something's going and want to make that public?
That's correct. The question is, does an agency have to publish a formal notice of withdrawing a proposed rule? No. A proposed rule, as the person commented, some rules take years to go from start to finish. And perhaps a new administration comes in that doesn't support the policy. It just may die a death of silence in that case. Now, a final rule is at a different stage of the rulemaking game, right? We've gone through the proposed rule. What has happened in between a proposed rule being published and a final rule being published? What do you know now has happened in between those times?
Comment period.
Comment period has happened. So comments have been received. And the agency has had to, by law, look at those comments, consider them, and in response, take into account those comments in issuing its final rule. So let's talk about what a final rule is. This rule is going to have legal effect. This is not a proposed rule. This is really going to take effect. And it has general applicability to the public. That's the definition of a rule: legal effect and general applicability. If it's not general applicability, it's specific applicability, and that is a rule, but it's more a decision of, for instance, the Social Security making a decision that, yes, I am eligible to retire and can take my Social Security. That has legal effect. It does apply to me, but it's specific and not general. So we don't publish the fact that I'm getting Social Security benefits, if I am, in the Code of Federal Regulation. Just what's generally applicable. Most rules amend and are codified in the CFR. Now, I hope that statement sort of makes you stop and say, I thought all rules are codified in the CFR. So just as I asked you, are there any laws that aren't codified in the U.S. Code? Let me ask you, are there any rules, or what rules would not be codified in the Code of Federal Regulations? Well, remember we used an example of a temporary law. It is a law, but it appropriates money for just 1 year. And then next year it's a different amount. That's a law. Well, there are temporary regulations. In fact, I've already told you of it. One example. I told you about the Coast Guard issuing a regulation that restricts boats in a particular area for a couple days around July 4th. Do you want us to, as a public citizen, take the time to amend the Code of Federal Regulations and then unamend it at the end of that period? In other words, those kinds of temporary rule changes to the standing rules, we would not change in the book, okay? Does that make sense? But they're not going to make it into the final version. Now, you would find those on the ECFR, because if it's a change during a period of time, you'll see that in real time in the ECFR, but in the coded book, that kind of a regulation would not. All other regulations are in there, okay? There's no other area that you find regulations.
Do they have to solicit public comment on a temporary rule if it's only, hey, a couple days, or is there?
The question is, are comments solicited on temporary rules? I'll address that in a minute. So a final rule is going to amend the CFR, finalize a proposed rule, unless in some very unusual circumstances I'm going to describe, it takes final action without a proposed rule. The effective date is going to be 30 days after publication, no sooner than that, for a major rule defined by its impact on the public or dollar amount. It will be 60 days. Now here's the exceptions. The Administrative Procedure Act says in emergencies or for good cause that the agency makes, the effective date can be sooner. I frequently use the example of the sorry events of 9/11. The Federal Aviation Administration issued a rule that immediately required the cockpit doors on airplanes to be locked before takeoff. And they didn't wait 30 days because this was an identified security problem, and they wanted to address that right away. However, in issuing that rule, and this is to answer your question a minute ago, they are required to provide the public the opportunity to comment. So it could be that while what seemed like good public policy at the moment, perhaps flight attendants had good reasons to say, well, that rule should be amended this way or that way, because actually our real life experience is something that needs addressing. So, and then the FAA or whatever agency would have had to respond to those comments and take appropriate action. But an agency can move more quickly if they can make the case for that. Now, in making that case, of course, you're opening yourself up to potential litigation, because all of this process is something that anybody could challenge in court. So agencies need to be able to not act, remember, arbitrary or capriciously. They need to be able to defend actions they're taking, particularly actions where they go for these exceptions. just as there were multiple types of proposed rules, there are multiple types of final rules. And I'm going to be describing interim final rules and direct final rules, and also some documents that relate to that final rule stage of the game. First of all, though, let's look at a rule. And those of you who have a book in front of you, you can turn to page 63-205. And I'm going to direct you in that page 63-205 to the second document, a document being issued by the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. If you just look visually at the page, it looks identical to the proposed rule, doesn't it? Has all the same captions, all the visual cues appear to be the same. And that's the case, because for the most part, you need to know the same kind of information. You need to know what agency is proposing the rule. You need to know what part of the CFR is being affected by this rule. You need to know, or you might want to be interested in what the docket number and what the RIN number is. And you want to know what basically the subject of this is. So in this FDIC rule, we're looking at the enforcement of some contracts. After those initial headings, we have the same 7 captions. You're going to see this in every Federal Register document. We have the agency name again. We have the action. In this case, it says final rule. We have a summary. The summary might be updated based on changes that have happening between the proposed rule and the final rule. Then you have the dates. Now, this is not a proposed rule, so why do we have a date section in the final rule? What date is still something we need to know?
Effective date.
The effective date, right. In other words, an editor of this book needs to know what day to actually do the cutting and pasting, whether it's electronic or physical cutting and pasting. Okay, that's very important, because if it starts on December 1st and we edit the book on November 1st, we are pushing enforcement of the rule 30 days earlier than is legally permitted. All right, so that's a key date. So that's one change. The addresses remains same. For further information is probably still the same, but the supplementary information is now real different. First of all, the history that it describes is new, is updated, right? We now have information about what's happened since the proposed rule was issued. There could have been environmental changes, there could have been legal situation, there could have been court challenges, who knows, lots of different information. But again, that should be written so that somebody who is new to the process, who wasn't here when the proposed rule was initiated or wasn't aware of that, is completely up to date on what the status of the situation is. That's key in the supplementary information. Then you're going to find all of those regulatory analyses that were required. You know, if the agency was required to address the impact on paperwork by issuing this regulation, then that has to have been addressed. And the agency may say this regulatory action has no effect on, a particular area of analysis, and then it doesn't have to do the analysis. But remember, that decision can be challenged, that judgment could be challenged in court. So this process, by being open and being defined, provides us a lot of protection to ensure that agencies don't act arbitrarily. Now, the next and very important section in the supplementary information is going to be the agency's responses to public comments. And I want to spend a little bit of time on this. So if half of the responders say we like this change and half of them say we don't like this change, that presents a bit of a challenge, right, for the policy person who's reviewing this and coming up with the new final regulation. But let's say it's lopsided. Let's say 20% of the responders support the change, 80% oppose it. What is the obvious thing that the person writing the final rule has to do, or the agency? What do they have to do? What's obvious? If it's 20 to 80%, what's the agency obviously going to do? Well, if you were on the floor of Congress and your constituents, you took a poll of the constituents and 80% of them supported something and 20% opposed it, how would you vote? Probably. You'd support it, right? So obviously the agencies have to go with the majority vote, right? I'm trying to lead you down a path and trip you up here. The answer is no. This is not a vote. This is input from the public. Now, think about input. You might have 50,000 postcards and 500 handwritten letters. You know, a person taking the time to sit down and write handwritten letter is obviously putting a lot more effort and thought into this than my just signing or sending in a postcard that somebody handed me, right? So that doesn't mean that my opinion is any better or wiser or more important, but it just says you can't just count numbers when receiving that information. So that's one reason an agency isn't simply going to go, well, we're taking a majority vote and go with that. Another reason is because by law, the agency is the one that is given the responsibility of doing the analysis, okay? And while I might have, as a citizen, a particular point of view on the issue, I have just my point of view. And the agency's got to take in not just my point of view, and not just the point of view of the people who happen to comment, but the bigger picture, the biggest picture, the public good, following the law's instructions. So an agency is in the position of saying no, even despite the fact that we received a majority of opposition, we still are going forward with this particular direction in the regulation. Now, if there's a lot of opposition, politically you understand, that agency is taking some risks that they're going to have to plan for. But legally, the point is the agency is the decider on these issues. Now, usually regulations are not just this yes or no on the whole regulation. Usually there's very complex aspects to regulation. So people are commenting on parts of the regulation. And the way the agencies will respond to those in their final rule is they'll say, we received 50 comments on section 32. Addressing a weakness in it. We received 10 comments from associations who support another section. And so they'll group them and then they'll respond to those, okay? But in responding, the response will be very detailed. And if there's any change between what was proposed and what the final rule says, then the agency in this document is going to spell that out. All of that you're going to find in this supplementary information. And at the end of that, the bright shining light, the list of subjects affected, followed by what? The actual rule, right? So if you're looking for how is this rule going to change the Code of Federal Regulations, you're going to go to that list of subjects affected heading, and you will find there, after that, the actual regulations telling you how to change the rule. So a proposed rule is written similarly to a final rule. Now, we've talked about that in paper. Let me take you to the electronic world and show you this, okay? Here is federalregister.gov. Here is that same information organized this way. There are 10 proposed rules in this Federal Register that I'm looking at. There are 13 rules, one presidential document. If I click on one of these rules, you'll see that the elements of this document that I showed you on paper are just organized a little differently, hopefully in a way that's perhaps easier. On the side here, on the right-hand side, we collect some of that information that was on the captions. In the body, we have a table of contents for the document, which is a very useful tool. So if in a long document, a 500-page document or a 200-page document, you can click right to the section you're looking at. So all of these elements are here, they're just organized a little differently. So I want you to find in all the electronic materials this basis in the printed version. Go back to our presentation. A special kind of final rule is an interim final rule. This is the final rule where they're going to seek a early implementation. And as we said, it usually reacts to an emergency situation. The agency has to take public comments, but it can be effective earlier than 30 days. Another very unique type of final rule is it's called a direct final rule. Another unique kind of document is a direct final rule. The direct final rule is the only document in the rulemaking world that doesn't require a proposed rule first. And it was created in order for agencies to move a little more quickly through non-controversial rulemaking actions. What happens is an agency will issue a direct final rule. They have to push off the effective date till 30 days. It can't be immediately effective, so it can't be an interim final rule. There is a comment period. But the difference is, if a single negative comment is received, then the document must be withdrawn. So a single negative comment can make the rule not go forward. So it truly is for non-controversial actions. Now, what an agency will often do is at the same day that they publish a direct final rule, they'll publish a proposed rule that does the very same thing. In effect, starting 2 trains down the track. And if the direct final rule, gets stopped early by a negative comment, the proposed rule, they don't have to start at the very beginning again. It's already on its way down the track. And the agencies don't do that in secret. They will make reference to the direct final rule and the proposed rule on the day of publication. There are also, in the final rule section, issues of temporary rules, delaying, suspending effective dates, and the like. But I want to address briefly this interpretive rule. Let us say that an agency decided that a particular vehicle, let's say, I'll use kind of a odd example. Let's say all fire equipment in the federal government had to be painted fire engine red. Okay, so they issue this rule. And so any contractors who are supplying equipment to the federal government have to paint their equipment fire engine red. And so Company A paints their vehicles fire engine red and delivers them. And Company B, who happens to be right next to Company A, starts to paint theirs, and then they realize that their color is sort of a different color, it's a different red. And then they get to talking and they find out, well, we got our fire engine red from XYZ company, paint company, and we got our fire engine red from XYZ paint company. And even they were both called fire engine red, they're 2 different colors. So an interpretive rule would be the color that we intended when we said fire engine red was the fire engine red color of company ABC. Now, if that was the interpretive rule, that would be illegal, because they're narrowing the rule. They're actually making a new rule. They're saying that instead of it being fire engine red, it's ABC company's fire engine red. The only way for that to be a proper interpretive rule would be for them to say any color paint that's labeled fire engine red is okay. Now, I don't think that would be a good rule, because you get all kinds of different colors. So how would an agency fix that problem? They would probably have to go through and start a new proposed rule. Okay, they would have to start the process over. So it's important to write rules correctly, but I wanted to say that you can't undo a rule by reinterpreting. Okay, there are limits to the degree to which you can interpret what a rule is doing. So we've talked about proposed rules, we've talked about final rules. Our next type of document is a notice document. A notice document is a non-regulatory document. It just gives some information. We publish more notices than any other kind of document, but they aren't regulatory in nature. they can be published with two formats. Either this format with all the captions that we see before, or in just straight paragraph form. Now, because these aren't regulatory documents, I'm not going to spend any more time talking about notices. If you'd like to talk about those later, I'd be happy to do that. I want to move on to presidential documents. Presidential documents are executive orders, which you've probably heard of, proclamations, which you've probably heard of, and administrative orders or other miscellaneous documents. Why do we include presidential documents in a discussion of regulatory material? Maybe I can give you a little bit of historical perspective to help you understand that. Back in the 30s, before there was the Federal Register, any document that looked what we would call to be a rule would have been signed by the president. So the early documents that we published in the Federal Register carried Franklin Roosevelt's signature. He was the signer of these documents because as the person at the top of the executive branch of government that is issuing these rules, he obviously has the authority to do what anybody under him could do, right? If you supervise people, you can take actions that they can take, right? And likewise, that was what's happening. Well, as the government grew in complexity, as Congress delegated authority directly to agencies, we've reached a point where the president does not sign any regulatory documents anymore. We only get documents in our final rule section or proposed rule section that are signed by cabinet secretaries, administrators of agencies, assistant secretaries, deputy directors, and the like. They must have legal authority, but it's been delegated down the chain of command. And we still could get any one of those documents that would be appropriate for the president to sign any of those documents. He just doesn't. The documents that he does sign, and that he's retained the signature authority, and that he can't really delegate, are those that effect or put into place action that only he can take that affects the executive branch of the government. So they are rulemaking in the sense that they are rules governing the operations of the executive branch of government. Now that may have a secondary impact on all of us as private citizens, but specifically they're aimed at the executive branch of government. I'll give you an example. Can the president create a cabinet level department, a new cabinet level department? So if the president wanted to create the Department of Health, a new separate Department of Health, could the president create that? No. That's something Congress has to create. But within the office of the president, could the president create an Office of Health Affairs? Yes. And how would he do that? He'd do that by signing the executive order creating an Office of Health, okay? And that office would have lots of responsibilities and the like. So executive orders and proclamations. Proclamations are more hortatory, proclaiming Mother's Day, Thanksgiving's Day, but there are some substantive ones, like a national emergency is usually issued as a proclamation. These are part of the Federal Register system because we compile all the presidential documents in Title III of the Code of Federal Regulations. So one of the titles, one of the 50 titles of the Code of Federal Regulations is dedicated to presidential documents. We publish them in the Federal Register, and then and here's the difference, compile them in Title III, meaning this year's volume just has this year's EOs. Next year's volume has next year's EOs, okay? So if you throw out last year's volume, unlike the Title 21, when you threw out last year's volume, you just threw out an out-of-date version because it's a codification. The Title 3 is a compilation, and you'd be throwing away the actual set of documents from last year. So this is the one title that always grows by one volume each year, if you have it on your shelf. Executive orders were not created by law, they are tradition. They weren't even numbered until the Wilson administration, and at that point in time, the president asked that the earliest executive order be identified and given the number 1. So the earliest executive order number 1, was issued by Abraham Lincoln because it happened to be still in force when President Wilson was in office. And then every one in chronological order was numbered after that, and after, starting at that point then, they have continued. So we're up to about 13,000 executive orders. An executive order remains in force until it is revoked. It could be revoked by the president who issued it, or it could be revoked by 3 presidents later. But it continues in force across presidential administrations until revoked. We reprint them annually in Title III of CFR. Likewise, proclamations are numbered in that same way. They continue to be numbered, they continue in force, although usually, for instance, proclaiming Mother's Day would not last beyond that particular day, but a national emergency would. The president will issue administrative orders to his subordinates. He will ask them to do certain things, and he may ask that that document be published in the Federal Register for the public to see. So these are another set of presidential documents. The official compilation of this material is in a volume called The Public Papers of the President, which we issue every 6 months. And it's a beautiful volume that contains a portfolio of about 16 pictures from the time period. These are available online as well, being available for purchase. Those are the official historical record of the presidency. In this next section, what I'm going to do is show you some of the traditional and digital resources that we have to look at what we've just talked about. I've mentioned them already, but our premier tool for addressing or for accessing the Federal Register is federalregister.gov. I encourage you to get on this site, explore it. I think you're going to find it very, very helpful to you in exploring the Federal Register system. We launched it on our 75th anniversary. As I indicated, it's currently unofficial, and that's because right now it displays a mix of what is in the Federal Register and some other materials. To give it its official status, we have to be able to more clearly delineate what is from the Federal Register and what is information that we're also providing relating to it. We tried to create a look and feel of an online newspaper. We actually used USA Today as one of our models. Some of the features that you'll find in it, a persistence of documents. One of the frustrating things is you saw a document yesterday that was of interest to you, and today you get today's Federal Register, or you go online for today's Federal Register and you don't have yesterday's. Well, this creates a place where documents of certain topics will remain for their life of, for instance, the proposed rule period of time. We organize the documents by news sections, topical sections. Those are those flip illustrations that you saw when I went on to the Federal Register website. So notice as I click this site, we have money, documents relating to money issues, environmental issues, world, science and technology, business and industry, and health and public welfare. Now those are not official by any means, they're just categories that help organize the work and we think make it a little easier. Because prior to that, the only way you could look and categorize were by title or by agency. In addition, there is a page for each agency, and you can look at their recently published documents. This is a really useful tool. You can see the documents that are open for comment and when their comment periods are. One of the most significant features is that you can go directly from federalregister.gov to regulations.gov. And and make your comments. You can submit your comment directly from our site into regulations.gov. So you don't have to find it, then go to regulations.gov, re-find it, and then make the comment. It's a great feature. We bring up the summary and the key information right to the top so you can see it. There's an index of topics. And then there are a number of social networking and 2.0, Web 2.0 tools. For instance, let's say you create a search of a particular type of document that you're looking for. You can save that and subscribe to that search and then have pushed to you in the future documents that meet that criteria. So you can, that way, do research on a particular topic and stay up to date on a particular topic. The public inspection desk is available to you through it. I will talk about public inspection in just a moment. The Federal Register Index, that's the printed index that we've kept in the past. Executive orders and how they are being handled over history, their disposition. Information about the docket, material that's at regulations.gov, and many other features make this the go-to site if you haven't started using it for Federal Register documents. Let me back up for a moment and talk to you briefly about this concept of public inspection. When the law was passed, when the Federal Register Act was passed, again, we were in a time of not as good transportation or communication resources. And the question was, if this is official notice of government action, when can we say that notice is effective? Is it the moment the book comes off the press? Is it the moment I get it in my mailbox, maybe 2 weeks after the fact? The moment it lands on the doorstep of the Federal Register office? What's the moment of constructive notice? And Congress wrote into the Federal Register Act this concept of filing and public inspection. A document is placed on file, and that is its date of record for constructive notice. The filing date is the time we place this document on public inspection as well. And for about 70 years of our history, from the beginning till the first 70 years, public inspection was a physical desk in our office, in the reception area of our office, where you could come and you would see documents on file. Now, another provision was that any documents that can be published in the Federal Register must be on public inspection at least the day before. So you think of the implications of that, what you realize is that for the first 70 years, if you lived here in Washington or had access to someone in Washington, you could come to our office and look at tomorrow's Federal Register, because those documents were all the documents that were going to be in tomorrow's book. And so quite a large cottage industry of providing that information built up, and we would have dozens of people outside our office every morning waiting to get access to public inspection lists. They might be, have a particular interest in a particular type of documents. They would then compile those and provide them to members or sell that information. But there was an obvious problem that the access was limited, and this whole concept of access is at the heart of our genetic makeup at the Office of the Federal Register. So what now exists is the electronic public inspection desk. That is that these documents that are on public inspection are placed on an electronic board, which I'm going to show you in a minute, and you have access to them. They still are all the documents that are going to be published in tomorrow's version. So it's inside baseball about federal regulatory affairs, but it's inside baseball that somebody as far away from Washington as you can get has as easy access to it as I do sitting in my office in the Office of the Federal Register. So I will show you the public inspection desk, and I'm going to do that by going to our main website called ofr.gov, and And remember, this is the primary page. And I'm going to click on this blue button, Public Inspection Desk. And when I click on that, it's going to take me to two lists, a special filing list and a regular filing list. The regular filing list are all the documents that were on public inspection in the morning at 8:45. The special filing are documents that are added later in the day or are there because an agency wants early notification to the public of them or for various reasons. But you need to look through both the special filing list and the regular filing list. And they're just listed like a regular table of contents by agency name. We update this a couple times during the day. And as I say, this is as early a look at Federal Register documents as you can get. Now, because it is between the point of delivering it to the government printing office for printing and they're actually printing it, we can't show you the nice printed version. That's what's happening in that day in between. So what you're going to be looking at is a Word document. So it's not, it has all the elements that we talked about, all those captions, but it's going to be in Word format, not in the very nicely formatted Federal Register printed format. So that is public inspection. You also have in the book the traditional table of contents. One table of contents is by agency. One table of contents is by title. Because we generally have people looking at the Federal Register in one of two ways. They want to know what a particular agency did, or they want to know how a particular title of the CFR has been amended or is being proposed to be changed. You'll also find in the back of the Daily Federal Register a list of the sections of the CFR that have been changed during the month. Another traditional finding aid that we had is this book called The List of Subjects Affected. We still publish it once a month. And what it is a guide to all the changes that have been made or proposed since this last book was issued. So remember, this particular book that I'm looking at was revised as of April 1st. If it's now November, then I want to get the November list of subjects affected to be able to know what has been published in the Federal Register that affects this title in the meantime. All of that work is not necessary now that we have the electronic ECFR. The ECFR, you go to the ECFR, that work is done for you. But if you're doing historical research, many times you will have to get access to this to understand how and where and when changes were made. Any questions? Okay, having gone through pretty much what the Federal Register is and its contents, I now want to focus on the one remaining piece of the federal regulatory system that we haven't spent as much time on, and that is looking at a Code of Federal Regulations book in the same way that we looked at the Federal Register book. This is online, but you need to understand how it's organized so that when you look online, you'll have a taste for it. So I've put in front of you, each of you, the same book, and if you pick that book up and look at it, you'll notice that it is what title? No. What title? It would be a number. 21. And now tell me what subject is covered in Title 21? Food and drugs, right. Now, here's a trick question. How many books are there in Title 21? Can you tell from the cover? Well, 500, no. Here's the hint. This cover says parts 500 to 599. So that means at least there's one other book earlier that contains parts 1 to parts 499. Since this begins at part 500, right? We assume that there's another one. And also, you might not know this, but since it doesn't say parts 500 to the end, I know that there's at least one more book. So the answer to my question, how many books are at least 3? In reality, there are 9. Okay? So just realize that just because I'm looking at Title 21, a book that is part of Title 21, does not mean I'm looking at the entire set of Title 21. In this case, it would be a set of books about this Y. All of the regulations in Title 21. This is just parts 500 to 599. All right? Also, notice that on the cover, there's always a revision date. Okay? And the 1/4 of the CFR volumes, or titles, are revised every quarter. So if you had a set of the entire CFR, 1/4 of them would be revised on January 1st, 1/4 of them on April 1st, 1/4 of them on July 1st, and 1/4 of them on October 1st. The revision dates are staggered. So let's take a more in-depth look. The Code of Federal Regulations contains federal rules. Which branch of government issues federal rules? We learned this earlier. The executive branch, right? We're not looking at laws in the legislative branch. They have general applicability. That's the definition of a rule. It can't, if it's specific applicability, then it's not going to be in the Code of Federal Regulations. Okay? And it has current or future effect. What if it had effect in the past? Where is it? Well, it's in older volumes of the CFR that are now in the trash can or in the library. But all we want to know, unless you're doing historical research or you're involved in a law case, is what are the current or future rules. And by future, I mean they have been published in the Federal Register, but they may not be in effect on April 1st. They may come into effect on April 15th. But we know what they are, so they're published in there in italics. Both the ones that will be in effect from April 1st to April 15th and the ones that take effect on April 15th. Now, in the electronic version, in the ECFR, you're going to see the old language up till the 15th of April, and then the new language starting April 16th. It's a simpler thing in the electronic version. But that's why we say the CFR contains current and future language. To become a rule, language must pass through the Federal Register. Okay, there's no other way for any language, any changes to be made in the CFR other than through something that's published in the CFR. There are now 230 of these books in the total collection, but remember there's only 50 titles or 50 subjects. Those subjects are broad subjects. They aren't agencies. So we don't have a book for the Department of Veterans Affairs, but we do have a book that deals with veterans. But there are multiple agencies that issue regulations that have to do with veterans, including the Department of Veterans Affairs, but also the Defense Department and some other agencies. So that's what the broad subject categories are, like environment, like defense, like public health, like transportation, or like food and drugs. I've already told you that we revise them in quarters. There's a uniform numbering system throughout most of the CFR. A few of the titles have a very unique system, particularly the IRS regulations. But at the heart of the CFR is a section. The section is the basic building block of the CFR. Here's how you would refer to a section in the CFR. 12 CFR, part 3 or section 303.1. The text is divided in both ascending and descending ways. So let's start at the top. Remember, title is a broad subject. Individual agencies get chapters. Okay, so here's where you come to the agency-specific regulations. Chapter 3 in this case, and it's written as Roman numerals, would be all the regulations of a particular agency. And then a particular program is going to be a part. Now notice the correlation between the first digit of the part and the chapter number. This is chapter 3, so all the parts are going to start with a 3. If this were chapter 15, then this would be section 1503. Okay? There's a connection there. Below the part is a specific provision of the program, and that's what we call the section. That's what I call the building block. Below that can be paragraphs that further explain the section, and it can get ugly. Notice that you could divide or go as far as 6 levels of differentiation below that. We ask agencies not to do that, to stop at 3, because this gets very complex, but you will find in a few instances that nomenclature. If you're going to have more than that, just create a new section and continue on. So, let's do rulemaking from start to finish, all right? And look at the book through that lens. Now, what triggers rulemaking? I shouldn't have put this slide up. I should have asked you that before you see the answers up there. But read some of those things off there. Tell me why would an agency engage in rulemaking? Can you connect with some of these? Obviously, legislation. Give me probably the biggest piece of legislation that has created rulemaking in the past couple of years. The Affordable Health Care Act, right, created an enormous requirement for an enormous number of regulations from the Medicare and Health and Human Services. How about an executive order? Well, executive order, the president may order something to be done. The courts may issue decisions that require agencies to issue implementing regulations. There can be emergencies. I referenced 9/11. Political factors. We referenced that the rule change relating to tobacco. So there's no one reason why agencies engage in rulemaking. But the one that I'm going to use as an example is one that started from a change in law. Remember this picture that we had? The process starts with law as the authority for a rule. There's a proposed rule, final rule, review by Congress, and then implementing it including it into the Code of Federal Regulations. Well, as an example of this process, and to give you a taste of what the CFR looks like, back in the late 1990s, Congress passed the Animal Drug Availability Act, which was an amendment to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So it changed the law. It expanded the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act's provisions and gave the Food and Drug Administration some responsibility to administer regulations and just to get into the details that dealt with testing animals. Okay, so we test these new drugs and foods on animals to see if they're safe for human consumption. And apparently there have been some problems in that testing, and so Congress passed legislation that said, FDA, issue some rules about how we're going to test these drugs on animals. So that's the broad public policy goal, passed by Congress, assigned to an agency. So here is the slip law, or the public law, and hopefully we're going to pull together a lot of things that we just said. Notice that it has a legislative number, HR 2508, and the date it was passed. It has a public law number, Public Law 104-250. It has a place where it's cited, a citation for the U.S. statutes at large, Volume 110, Stat, page 3151. And it has a reference to the United States Code, 21 U.S. Code, Part 301. So in effect, there's 4 addresses for that text, 4 ways you could find that text by its legislative number, its public law number, its U.S. statute citation, or its U.S. Code location. In the text of the law is this language that I highlight in yellow, and I'll just read it out loud to you. It says that not later than 6 months after the date of the enactment of this legislation, the Secretary of Health and Human Services shall issue proposed regulations. So right there you have the authorization, which is necessary, for the Secretary to issue regulations. And also it happens to have this unusual 6-month time frame. So there it shows there's some urgency. Okay, that's an additional requirement. It's above and beyond what the Federal Register Act or the Administrative Procedure Act requires. And then the second section says, the second yellow highlighted section says that not later than 18 months after enactment, the Secretary will issue final regulations. So basically, Congress has put them on a timeline. So 6 months from now, we want a proposed rule published in the Federal Register. 18 months from today, we want your final regulation in place. So the wheels at the FDA begin to turn, and they produced this document, a Federal Register document. And let me show you a raw document. It looks like this, published in Word. We edit it, we go through, you'll see some red markings in it. When we receive this document in our office, it is not on file. It's been received by our office, and it is confidential. So if you were to call me and say, hey, do you have this document that I heard about? Where is it? I would have to say no comment. The first moment at which I can say anything about this document is when we put it on public inspection. Okay? So the document looks and has all the elements that we discussed. Notice the action line is a notice of proposed rulemaking, NPRM, which is the formal name of a proposed rule. The dates section says that written comments are due by July 22nd. So this is published on May, and they're giving us June, July, 2 months to comment. That's a pretty short period of time. At the end of the document, after they describe why they're publishing this proposed rule, they give us the actual rule language. And I'm reproducing here instruction number 3, which says that a new part, 514.117, is added to read as follows. So here's the text. So if you were an interested veterinarian or chemistry lab or biological lab, you might read through this, because this is telling you how you can produce adequate and well-controlled studies that the federal government would accept in testing new drugs. You read through that and you have some questions about it. So you write your comments or maybe objections to the FDA, to the person that was described in the Federal Register notice, and the FDA collects all those, and now they're under the time gun because they're supposed to produce this final regulation within 18 months. They get consensus within the agency on what the final regulation will be. They send it up through OMB to get OMB approval, and we are delivered a document that they call a final rule document, and we publish it. So here you see now the action is no longer proposed rule, it's a final rule. Notice the date is March 5th. The date section is no longer when comments are due. It says the regulations are effective on April 6th. April 6th is 30 days after March 5th. Why the 30-day gap? Because the Administrative Procedure Act says you can't make final rules, new rules, effective until 30 days has gone by to give people time to adjust, right? So there you're seeing that in reality working. Then we have the supplementary information in which the agency describes the history. They talk about the new law, they talk about the proposed rule, and then they get to the point of responding to comments, okay? So up here I have reproduced some of the comments that were provided. And in green, I've highlighted a sentence that I'm not going to read, but it basically says, you know, one of those comments was right on target, and as a result of that, we're removing some of the language and changing it in our final rule. And the reason I highlight this is to tell you they had to tell us specifically what the change was, because the last time I saw this, it was written this way, and now it's going to be this way. And if I am going to make the connection between, oh, there's a change, they have to be very specific in telling me not only that they agreed with the comment and are going to make the change, but here's the way they're going to make the change, okay? And then at the end of the document, they actually provide the language. So now we have instruction number 1, instruction number 2, and instruction number 3. There could be others, but instruction number 3 says that this new section, 514.117, is added to read as follows. I want you to open your books this red book, to page I believe it's 84, sorry. Yes, page 80. Page 85, do you see at the top of the second column, section 514.117? Okay, this is that section. It got into this book on that date. If you turn the page and look for the next part, which is 2 pages over, first of all, note that the next section is not what you'd expect. Didn't you expect the next section to be 514.118?
Yes.
But it's 120. So what happened to section .118 and .119? Was there an editor's mistake here? Did we drop some information? Well, a couple things could have happened. One is there may never have been a 119 and a 118. So it's a gap, that's okay. As long as the numbers continue to go up, that's not a problem. If the number went backwards, then we would be an editing problem. Maybe there used to be a 118 and a 119 and they were removed. Sometimes you'll see 118 and 119 reserved because they know that they're going to put some in. But gaps are okay, it's just that the gaps go in the opposite number direction, that's a problem. But right above there, do you see that in brackets? It says 63 FR 10770 and then a date. Do you see that date is this date? That is a source note to this page of the Federal Register. It's basically telling you, if you want to know how this section entered this book, look there, okay? Now at the beginning of Part 514, see if you can find that page where Part 514 starts in this book. If you haven't found it yet, it's page 54. You see new Part 514? At the beginning of every part, there is a table of contents for that part. This goes all across the CFR. Every volume of the CFR will have this. At the bottom of the table of contents, there's another source note. And it says 40 FR, March 27, 1975. What it's telling you is that in March 27 of 1975, that document, this part 514 was entered into the CFR. And then in 1996, the part was amended, as we just saw with Part 514.117. So we've gone really into the details of this, but what I'm trying to show you is not only the structure of the CFR, but how much information is in it about how to find why this information is there. So ultimately, if you were reading this and you were looking at that section and you said, how did that become a rule? Because it just doesn't seem to make sense. You would be able to find the citation, go to the Federal Register page, and read the documentation about it. One more thing that I'll point out is just below that table of contents, there was an authority citation. That's that first instruction that you find in every rule that tells our editors whether or not the authority citation is changed, and if so, how. And that's because we always want to carry, along with the regulations, the citation to the authority for issuance of those regulations. So that is a description of the CFR and how it gets amended from start to finish. There are some other resources in the back of the CFR. For instance, a list of all the titles and chapters. There's also a list of agencies that publish in the Code of Federal Regulations and where you find your regulations. There's a great description of the CFR system in the front of the book as well. So with that, I thank you for your time and attention. I'll be glad to take some questions.